If it sounds good, then it is good. But be prepared. It's not going to sound good as you begin to play by ear. But, as the feller says, practice makes perfect. You're bound to get better at it. Just plan to make lots and lots of mistakes at the outset as you pick out tunes by ear and try putting chords with them. So don't worry about how it sounds at first. And above all, don't worry about whether your friends and relatives will laugh when you sit down to play. By and by, they'll sing a different tune. Root notes follow. It's a path, all right. It sounds like a path, and a well-worn path at that. But it doesn't look like a path, at least not the way it's laid out in printed music. That's because there's no room in printed music to show the path of root notes the way it really looks. And the way it really looks is exactly like a plain, ordinary, everyday circle. Or rather, a plain, ordinary, everyday clock. The song has to be Red River Valley, of course, because the director hates it. As you'll see, the chord progression begins on a home bass chord, and the other chords move away from home bass and back to it. In this instance, the home bass chord is G. And the other chords of the song move away from it and back to it. That path makes much better sense on the circle than it does in printed music. Take another example of the same movement, the same kind of chord progression on the circle. This time, the home bass is on F, and as usual, the other chords move away from home bass and back to it. So far, we've been seeing and hearing the most elementary kind of chord progression on the circle. It's an elementary chord progression because the chords don't wander far from home. No farther, in fact, than the neighbor on either side of home base. Now, this is the stuff of most children's songs, folk songs, hymns, patriotic songs, and the like. What keeps the chord progression so close to home base is the magnetic pull of the home base, the way the dinner hour on the clock pulls everybody to the table from wherever they are. As composers discovered over the years, the magnetic attraction of home base is very strong. So strong, in fact, that it can pull quite a long progression of chords toward itself. You've heard that harmonic movement at least 1 trillion times. It's the traditional, the standard, the classical chord progression in popular music. And here's how these classical progressions move on the circle. As you would expect, the progression begins on home bass, F for example. Then it jumps backward and starts back clockwise, stop by stop, until it's home again, as in this classic by Rodgers and Hart.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of
Now, classical chord progressions don't always cover exactly 1/4 of a circle. Sometimes the jump backward is less than 1/4 circle, say from home bass back only 2 stops, as in this waltz by Strauss. And sometimes the chord progression is longer than 1/4 of a circle. In fact, it's almost a half circle jump backward, as you can see and hear in this one.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make his complexion like peaches and cream. Give him 2 lips like roses and clover. Then tell me that my lonesome nights are over.
And sometimes a song uses more than one type of progression. For example, it can combine a classical progression of less than 1/4 circle with an elementary progression using the neighbor next door to home bass, and a classical progression that uses more than 1/4 circle. To be very specific about it, take the song New York, New York. It begins on the home bass of F, jumps less than 1/4 circle backward to G, and then comes home by way of C. Then the chord movement changes. It becomes an elementary classical progression by incorporating the neighbor next door to home bass, in this case, B flat. And now it's back to a classical progression, but this time with a backward jump longer than 1/4 circle from home bass all the way back to A. Well, that's basically how chords move on the circle. There's an elementary progression that never goes farther from home bass than the next door neighbors. And most common of all in standards, the classical progression with its jump backward and clockwise journey home.
blue moon, you saw me standing alone.
True, you might find attempts here and there to camouflage it, but they don't really fool anybody. For instance, sometimes the progression doesn't start on the home bass at all. Instead, it starts out on the homeward path and works its way back home. But as you can see and hear, it's still very much a classical progression. There's another way that chords move on the circle, and that's with the use of 2 home basses. Romantic chord progressions usually work this way. The tune begins with its chords centered around the first home bass. A few bars later, the tune repeats.
and the chords follow a similar path, but around a different home base. Put them both together and you've got a romantic chord progression. Now, that doesn't mean that the circle is the only path chords follow in popular music. Once in a while, in printed music, you might see a progression that doesn't seem to follow the circle. This kind of progression usually makes more sense when you realize it follows the alphabet, the way the notes come along on the keyboard. What holds this progression together is the line made by the bottom notes of the chords. This line of bass notes, this bass line, is as strong an organizer as the circle. So, in many tunes, the progression can be taken off the circle and the chords put on a bass line. You can look on this bass line as the bottom of a sandwich, a bottom made of notes that come along alphabetically. The top of the sandwich is the melody line. And the filling of the sandwich is chord notes. Which chord notes? Why, any chord notes at all, just as long as the chord includes the bass note and sounds good with the melody. When it comes to holding a chord progression together, a bass line is just as strong as the circle, and that's true for classical music as well as popular. Take Johann Sebastian Bach and his Minuet in G. Obviously, he wrote it with the circle pulling his chords along. But a bass line will pull the chords along just as firmly, though they won't be the same chords that Bach used. A melody. Then you put some chords with it. And then you create an arrangement with it using all sorts of devices. And that, it turns out, is also the description of playing by ear, with a couple of small differences. In playing by ear, you recreate the melody from your mind without using printed music. And you decide on which chords to use in your arrangement. And neither of those two items is very hard to do, as you'll see. Okay, the first item is the tune. To begin playing by ear, you have to recreate a tune from your mind without using printed music. And that means you have to know the melody all the way through. You can't recreate a tune from your mind if you don't have a tune in your mind.
In the halls of Montezuma, excavating for a mine. Oh, my darling, the United States Marines.